Hey folks, Steve here with another Fatal Alliances video. I know it's been quite a long time since I've been able to do a video in this series and really do too many videos at all besides a few unboxing videos. A lot of that has to do with the move that I'm pretty much done with. I'm set up in my new place. You can sort of catch glimpses of my game room in some of the unboxing videos I just did for World War I by Decision Games and Medieval by HDN Games. I'm mostly situated, and now it just comes down to getting the time to sit down and actually record, and working on things. And I know a lot of folks are still waiting on World in Flames videos. That is to come. But I wanted to sort of capstone my Fatal Alliance video series with a few of these advanced warfare videos. I could conceivably get all of this stuff demonstrated and shown in one video. It's just going to depend on how long this all takes to demonstrate. But one of the things that occurred to me a while back was that, I've talked a lot about this game in several different videos, looking at land units, sea units, air units, different mechanics and things. And then when I played through an entire turn, and you guys watched me do it, if you sat through all of that, by sitting through that first turn, we got to see a lot of different gameplay mechanics. We saw land combat. We got to see naval combat. We got to see basically a early battle of Jutland, and see how that came out. We got to see a little bit of subs attempting to do strategic warfare, offensives. I mean, we managed to fit a lot in, and I tried to cram as many different things in there as I could. The reality is that there were some things that I could not show in that first turn, because that first turn that I played through was the first turn within the 1914 scenario. Now, the one thing that's really great about Fatal Alliances is that not just the 1914 type of stuff, but later in the game, as the force pools change with the years, you get different types of units that reflect the advances in technology of World War I. So gas units, armored units, the stormtroopers that were basically these assault troopers, the famous Sturmtruppen of the German army, and so on, that were all attempts to break the deadlock of the trenches and everything. And so none of that stuff really got to make it into that first turn video. And one major feature of the game that we didn't really get to cover at all was actual air combat and air mechanics. And, for those who are kind of familiar with World in Flames, the air combat stuff is much, that's just part of the World War II game of this system. Right out of the gate, you're sort of dealing with air combat. But in Fatal Alliances, as the World War I game, the very beginning of the game, you're dealing mostly with these balloons and a couple of very, very basic land bombers that, you really don't even want to call them land bombers. Really what they are, observation planes. And they're basically, either negating a negative or causing a negative to somebody's combat roll, or helping with artillery spotting. And so, those are very basic things, and in the process of the previous gameplay demonstrations, it was like, boom, you're done. Are you within range to do observation or anti-observation? But there's so many more layers to that within the game once you actually start getting planes that are more capable of doing ground strikes, ground support, strategic bombing. And then you have the entrance of fighter air units, which we didn't really cover at all because they don't come into the game until, I think, you get them in 1915, and you got to build them, and you only get a few, and it's not until 1916 and further do you actually have a fair number of fighter units. And that really changes the whole situation of the air missions. And so what I plan to do in this video, and if it takes it, additional videos, is cover these advanced warfare concepts that only come into the game later in the scenario, within several turns after the start, which we didn't get to really show. And what I've done to facilitate that is I have created here It's just on the Western Front, a manufactured situation. And so I've grabbed several units from the later year force pools. I've arranged them in such a way where I can use some of these other units. And while we might not play as if it were a real turn, I'm going to run through the sequence of play on how these different units will interact with one another when you're playing the game. And sort of, I'm not going to be a genius at strategy for sure. I'd never claim to be when it comes to this system because it's still, a complex new system in relative terms to me. I can at least show you how these units are used, and so you can see what I'm showing here. There are several. The fighter airplane units are the planes that are flying to the left, and where we get a side view, those are fighters. The planes, where we're seeing them above and they're flying, up this way. Those are typical bombers. And we've also got some of the mechanized units, the armored divisions, and somewhere out here we've got some anti-tank artillery and some gas units down here to demonstrate some gas units. So I've just grabbed a whole bunch of stuff. I've arranged it here in some approximation of a 1917-ish situation. The reality is, a front's probably not going to look like this in a real game where all the units are face up. All of them are sideways, which means they're entrenched, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And, it's very neat and clean because, again, this is a manufactured situation. So you got the planes up here in Britain, and nothing else is in Britain because, this is, again, manufactured. So when you're looking at this, just know that your game in 1917 may not look like this. It's probably going to be a little messier. You may have units that are all over the place, flipped, and holes in the line potentially. So don't stress too much about what's literally here. The purpose of this video is, again, to demonstrate how these different units interact. So let's get it going here. We're 7 minutes in, a little over 7 minutes, so I want to get moving. First thing I want to talk about is the nature of entrenchments. So this was something that was added in the first major rules revision for the game that came out, a year ago. And it's, but whatever the latest rules version that is out there now, which is version 1.1H, I think, it's on the Compass website if you need to download the PDF. In 21.6 of the rules, there is this section for entrenchments. Now, we didn't do anything with entrenchments in the first turn playthrough because you can't actually start building these entrenchments until September, October 1914, and they are limited by gearing limits, and so there's sort of, you're not going to get a whole bunch of these entrenchments quickly, but obviously they are the sort of added mechanical portrayal of the trenches that were dug in World War I. Prior to the rules revision, where these entrenchments were not part of the rules, I think we all just sort of, as the game player community looking at this game, accepted the trenches were at a lower level than what the game was portraying, and we're okay with that because the combat charts, reflected that somehow. And apparently that maybe wasn't the case, or maybe there was a feeling like it wasn't portraying that enough, and you really needed to have entrenchment shown on the map, and so this was added in. Now the idea is that an entrenchment costs a build point and takes one turn to build. So you build it, next turn it's available. It is subject to gearing limits, and the rulebook basically states that you can build one in September, October, then you could do up to two in November, December, and so on. And the only kind of tricky thing is when it comes to like the and this is just the default production spiral and where things were at, or at least I think it was. If you look at the production spiral, you're putting counters on here, right? You've got counters for offensives, you've got counters for fortress hex sides, which I don't have any here now, but that would be something you'd be looking at. But for these entrenchments, there aren't counters for them. So when you're building them, what you're probably going to end up using is some piece of paper and put it on your production your production spiral when playing the physical game. In Vassal, I would just use a setup anywhere token, and then I would change the label and just say, two German entrenchments or whatever. But once they're done building, what you do is that you're going to designate a core, and it's very important that it's a core, not a division. So you can see in some of these stacks, the core are turned, and the division is not. So when you place an entrenchment, you take a core, an in-supply core, and you're going to rotate it 90 degrees. And it doesn't tell you which way to rotate it 90 degrees, but what I sort of what makes sense in my mind for showing it is to point the top of the counter towards the enemy, roughly, the front line. So you can see, these guys are pointed left, 90 degrees to the left. They're, sort of pointed that way. Now, again, you're not very often going to just find all these units where every core and every hex on the front that is available is able to cleanly be entrenched like this. It's probably going to be a little bit harder than that. But that's what you're going to do. Now, entrenching does a couple of things for you. One, it's going to halve ground striking factors from aircraft and artillery, unless a spotter is used, so that gets back to observation planes. And basically, those observation planes are going to be treated like bombers when it comes to air combat. And again, we'll get into that soon. But each defending core that is entrenched like that gives a -1 to an attack. And if engineers are used to give their +1 bonus against any entrenched unit, those engineers will suffer the first loss. So it's essentially like the reverse of, a reverse of being disorganized, right? When you get hit by artillery, you flip your unit, you flip the counter, and all of a sudden an attacker gets a +1 to the die roll. Well, with this entrenchment, they've got a -1 to the attack roll. And so, in any particular hex like this, if I've got 2 core that are entrenched, that's now a -2 to the die roll. And that's fairly significant. So some of the other things just, to know is that, like, once you move units that are entrenched, they are going to not become entrenched anymore. That's sort of obvious. Now, you might say, well, certainly those trenches still exist, even if a unit leaves it. But what you have to sort of imagine that is, at this level of abstraction, if someone leaves, those trenches are going to get some wear and tear from rain. They're not being maintained, and they'll just sort of go away. There's maybe some waffling you could have on that. But I think if you were to try to make it any more complicated, it would be, a lot more complication for not a lot of benefit. So basically, again, you're spending some production. You're settling these units down into a stationary place to provide that defensive entrenchment. So you have that all across the board. That's going to make attacking difficult. It's going to make what would have normally been a normal attack in turn 1 much more difficult. In turn 1, we're reliant mostly on our infantry units, maybe our cavalry units, artillery being the thing to flip units and support attacks along with offensives. But even with offensive benefits, that -2 to the die roll is pretty painful and will turn what could be decent odd attacks into very risky attacks. Very tough for that. So that's why these guys are turned to the left, and that's something that you won't see in turn 1. You're only going to start seeing on future turns. So then, what else do we have out here? We've got the gas units. So when they attack, if you don't have to always do this, but a gas unit, when it is attacking, you can choose to make it a gas attack. And if you do that, you're going to roll a die. And the details of this are on the 2d10 combat results table chart on the back of the physical rulebook. And basically, if you roll on a d10, if you roll a 1 or 2, so 20% chance, you're actually going to get a negative to your die roll. And that sort of represents, I think, the chance when they would shoot these toxic gas canisters that the wind could blow the poison back towards your line of the battle. So there's that 20% chance every time that it's going to send the gas back. There's a 20% chance, I'll roll out a 3 or 4, that there's no effect. And then from there, you're going to have somewhere, a 60% chance of getting a bonus to the die roll. And that 60% chance is split up between a +1, a +2, and a +3. Obviously, the ideal scenario when you're rolling a gas attack is you roll a 9 or a 10 and you get a +3. A +3 is pretty huge in terms of a bonus to attacking. Now, the only con to this, obviously, is you've got to watch out for that 1 or a 2. And then whoever uses a gas attack first impacts U.S. entry. And so this is an item that's on the U.S. entry chart. If, say France uses a gas attack first, that's going to potentially take a chit away from the U.S. entry pool. So the United States is a little more reluctant to join the war on the Allies side because they're using chemical weapons. But if Germany does it first, then obviously it's going to probably increase the chance that the United States will enter the war. So something to watch out for there. Let me check my notes here. Okay, let's talk a little bit about mechanized units and armor units. So these are division only, and mechanized are, again, these units with the oval with the infantry X over them. Sort of important to point out is that rather than in a World War II World in Flames game, mechanized infantry tends to mean, infantry supported by armored vehicles. In this game, for World War I, they are leg movement units that are not implied to actually be mechanized. That's one of the annoying things. It's not something that I would call mechanized, but they use the mechanized NATO symbol. But if you see on the label here for this unit, the Stosstruppen, Stormtrooper, this represents those assault units, the German World War I soldiers who would rush the trenches with machine guns. I hate getting that. There we go. Who would rush the trenches with machine guns, and they would, it was very, these shock troopers that would try to break through and gain territory, and then the rest of the German, forces would come up after they've done, have completed their attack. And so these are things that, from a German perspective, a central power player, you're really looking forward to having these guys. Because they're going to be your first opportunity to really make a difference on the die roll chart. So again, the combat charts, for probably the first bits of the game for a long time, you're only really using the assault column on the combat results table. But you can begin to use the blitz column of the table based on how many mechanized or armor units you actually have involved in a combat. So if you look at the notes on that 2d10 combat chart, it's sort of this teal, light blue, or green box. It's got the notes, and it talks about what the land combat procedure is. Well, there's a lot of different terrain types where the defender will always choose what table will be used, the assault or the blitz table. And that kind of makes it so that, terrain like mountains are obviously going to be an impediment to this assault shock strategy of the Stosstruppen, and would also be sort of an impediment to armor divisions. And so, in that case, the defender is always going to have it be the assault table. That's pretty much always the best option as the defender, I think. It tends to be a little bit bloodier. But if that's not the case, and it's a terrain where the defender doesn't automatically get to pick, so like a clear hex, for instance, then it's going to depend, right? If you're early in the war and you don't have any armor or mechanized units, then it's going to end up really auto-defaulting back to the assault table. But if you're the attacker and you have more armor than the defender, or you have more mechanized units than the defender, and the defender doesn't have anti-tank or armor, then you get to pick, and you're going to maybe want to pick the Blitz table because it tends to be a little bit safer for your attack, and you're going to potentially cause units to retreat. Um, and that's obviously a great way to kind of open up these lockdown fronts that you may get into with the World War I gameplay. One weird thing is that anti-tank units seem to have an effect on mechanized units in this game, and that is sort of a weird representation. I'm not sure how much that really makes sense because, again, these mechanized units aren't really mechanized. It's portraying something different than mechanized infantry. But in terms of the World in Flames system, that's just the right way to do it. And so, if you want to defend against that, then you're either going to have to match the enemy's mechanized or armor units with your own, or in the case of, where it makes sense, your anti-tank units, which I'm pretty sure only Germany actually gets anti-tank AT artillery, and I've got a unit here, right there, that 13.1 millimeter, out here in this sort of exposed hex that can be attacked on 3 sides. Yeah. So, that's sort of a quick review of kind of what's some of the new stuff going on here in terms of land units. But again, there's going to be some potential here to show off a lot of different things, and we'll try to run through again the sequence of play to make sure that everything is still played as if it were a normal turn. And if you're following along, again, you want to have your PDF open of the rules. You want to be looking at that combat chart, and then you probably want to have your actual player aid charts open because we will be looking at the air combat table when we get into actual air combat. So let's see. Let's check our sequence of play. So if I just take a look here, we're going to ignore naval air missions. They're pretty straightforward, and I don't think that's going to be something I'm going to bother portraying because it's just going to happen so infrequently in this game. No naval movement of any kind, but let's maybe look at strategic bombardment. I think this is going to be something worth looking at. Yeah, I think this is going to make sense to show. So let's pretend for a moment. Let's get started. We're gonna pretend like this is a Central Powers impulse, and there's the potential to do some strategic bombardment. If we look into the rule book, the strategic bombardment section of the rules, we will head to. I just scrolled past it. I'm getting lost. There we go. So 11.6, the PDF I'm looking at, that's page 15. We're going to do the strategic bombardment as the Germans. Now, when it comes time to doing a strategic bombardment, what you have to do is you have to look at your aircraft, and you have to look at what is going to be the lower right-hand side of the air counter to see if they have strategic bombardment factors. And so anything that has an asterisk here basically has none. So in terms of the strategic bombardment, we could do it with, I'll zoom in a little bit. We could do it with this bomber here. We could also do it with this bomber. So the Gotha G4, Gotha, I think that says Gotha. Gotha G5. Can't do it, can't do it, can't do it, can't do it. Another Gotha. We can do it with this guy, but, that's so low of factors, I'm not sure why. And we can also do it with this Zeppelin back here. So, let's see. If we're going to do some strategic bombardment, let's talk about what's going to be in range. So if we wanted to do, say, London, this Zeppelin's got a range of 9, so we count the hexes, and when counting over the water, you count the hex dots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So yeah, we could send that guy, and let's see, this one's range is 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. This one's 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we actually have a number of different bombers that could perform strategic bombardment against London. Um, I'm debating whether just sending the Zeppelin, because I mean, how iconic is that? But maybe we want to send 2. Now, obviously, some of these bombers that can do strategic bombing, they're also going to be probably our guys to do tactical bombing as well, and so we don't want to blow, our. I'm going to keep it PG. We don't want to blow all of our assets in one go. So I think maybe what we'll do is we're going to end up probably sending one of these Gothas and the Zeppelins on a strategic bombing run against the city of London, where the production of Britain is, or a lot of it is anyway. They got 3 factories here. So how does this work? Well, the first thing, if you look at 11.6, and this is actually the model how most air combat related actions go. The very first thing is you say, okay, we're doing the strategic bombardment phase of the turn. Now, in past videos, I would skip past this because there was nothing to do. So in the early part of the game, when there are no fighters, it's important to note, when there are no fighters, then you can basically skip strategic bombardment if you're not going to bomb anything, because there's no point. There's no air combat to be concerned about. But once these fighters start showing up, that's when you got to start to care. So the thing with fighters, FTRs, is that they're really the only type of plane that can do what they refer to as combat air patrol. They're the only ones that can escort bombers, and they're the only ones that can intercept. And there's going to be a distinction here that's important to note, and this is important even in the World War II World in Flames system version of this, is that combat air patrol and intercept do very similar things in that it puts the fighters in a hex that's going to be potentially bombed by the enemy. But the difference is when that's designated. So combat air patrol you can fly farther to where you think the action's going to be. So that's the very first step. So your opponent flies combat air patrol to potential target hexes. Then what's going to come next is that you fly all of your selected attacking bombers and escorting fighters to the target hexes. So this first part is what are the planes that your opponent has selected to just be defending the obvious targets if they're within range of their fighters. And then based on that, you're going to decide where you're going to send your forces. So you might say, well, if Britain is going to put, and if I just look at the fighters that are in the area, heck, the fighters that are even in range. Yeah, this is going to be interesting. You say, okay, well, this is going to be this fighter, the F2 fighter. Well, if they go here and say, hey, I'm going to do combat air patrol on London, that tells me as the central power player, well, obviously they've now given their resources to protect London. Now the question is, well, are there alternative targets that I want to fly my attacking bombers to? So now instead, I might say with this Gotha, if I have a range of 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, not a good target. I'm trying to see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I could, with this Zeppelin, instead go and bomb Coventry, right? So if they flew combat air patrol to defend London, I could send the Zeppelin to Coventry And since I know that that's pretty far out, he's not going to have an escort. But I do want to bomb London anyway. I don't want that to be the only thing going on. So I'm going to have this Gotha. 1, 2, 3, 4. I want to have this Gotha go. And I've probably made a very foolish decision in that I don't have any fighters that can actually do an escort. Well, we'll send it by its lonesome anyway. We say, it's fine. So this is he's also gonna go there. And I've made this choice. Again, this is sort of arbitrary, right? But if I had a fighter that could actually have the range for it, I really don't right now. If I had well, okay. So let's say, for the sake of the example, I'm going to change this up a little bit because I want to show you guys the right thing. So let's say I had this, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. This D3 plane is actually within range. 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3. No, he was in range anyway. Okay, well, oh god. Yeah, okay, it's fine. So he was here, 1, 2, 3 to London. He's the escort fighter. Now, again, going through the turn, we've, opponent flew combat air patrol to London. And then we've flown our units. So we sent our Zeppelin up to Coventry. We sent... we could even go to Birmingham. Send him to Birmingham. And then we've sent our Gotha with a escorting fighter to London proper to have a shootout with the defending fighter. So once we've done that, now your opponent flies intercepting fighters to target hexes. Now, interception is tougher because an interception mission, a plane's only going to fly with half its printed range flying towards the target hex. So, just as an example, if this was actually a fighter, it wouldn't have 5 to get there. It would have to work with, 3. I guess I think you round up there. And so while this isn't an example to get into it yet, we're going to do some more examples down here where it's going to make more sense. Interception, because it's the stuff that you're going to allot to defend the hex once the opponent's already committed, there is a con in that it has to already be nearby. So that's sort of the strategy, right? You want to put combat air patrol, where I guess it makes sense, or where you aren't in range of interception. And then when it comes times for the actual attack, you hope you have the right fighters near enough that they can fly that shorter distance as an interception to conduct the air combat. And then, in response, we could then fly intercepting fighters to the target hexes. The attacker could fly intercepting, and thus you have the potential, again, we're going to see this down below, but I just want to explain it. Combat air patrol, then the actual bombers with escorts, then the opponent intercepts, then you intercept. And so what can very well happen is, as this is, you're trying to decide how important this one engagement is, you could have each side piling in more of these plane units to take part in the air combat. And the reality is that, you don't want to do too much all at once. You don't want to send too many, but it's sort of one of those things. It's a back and forth. I'm going to give some, I'm going to give some. I'm going to send more guys, I'm going to send more guys. You're going to fight the air combat, and then surviving bombers are going to do their thing. And then you're going to return all the remaining aircraft to base based on their range, and they're going to turn face down. And then later they can be reorganized and turned face back up with an HQ unit or whatever. But that is roughly how air operations are conducted. And so you look at these. Well, there's a fair number of planes out here. In a real game, there might be fewer, there might be more. I just threw them out there. You got to be careful. You don't want to use all your fighters on a particular phase of combat. You don't want to use them all to make way for this strategic bombing, because you may need fighters on the opponent's impulse to run defense. So it's a different sort of resource management where you have so many of them, and you need to use them on attack. You need to use them on defense. You're going to use them as part of ground attacks, and there are going to be times when we're doing the land combat, and both sides are going to be putting bombers in. Both sides are going to be putting intercepting fighters in, or air patrol fighters in, and it's going to get real squirrely. And it's probably going to mean that the reality is, when we played the first turn, it went pretty quick because you just have infantry, and it just moves. Later turns of the game may go slower because you do have more of this intricate steps being taken each impulse on where you're allotting your air forces and what missions are being flown, and how that's being done. And it's one thing to point out that in terms of air missions, your activity limits, basically if you took a land or a naval or an air action, as long as you didn't pass, a power can do unlimited escorting, so as many escort planes as you want. You can do unlimited interceptions, you can do unlimited combat air patrol, and ground support. So, you are not limited in that way. But things like strategic bombardment, ground striking, that sort of thing will count against your mission limits, for your activity limits. But that's so the defender isn't totally shut out of being able to respond. You have these guys as needed. So for the strategic bombardment, obviously we're targeting hexes, enemy-controlled hexes that contain a usable factory, and we need to do our air combats. First things first, because I know there aren't going to be any air combats, and what we do won't make a difference either way. I'm going to look at this Birmingham bombing rate. So how does the bombing actually work? Well, after any air-to-air combat, total the strategic factors of all surviving bombers, in this case, strategic factor of 2. Half these factors attacking a hex in rain or snow. I didn't talk about it, but for the sake of this example, we're going to say that this is just clear weather. Locate the total on the strategic bombardment table. So this is the same chart that we used for the strategic warfare example from the turn where we had subs attacking convoys. It's the same chart next to the air combat on the player aid. So we're going to look at that, and okay, so we're going to roll a die, cross-reference the roll with the modified strategic bombardment factors. Since we only got 2, we're going to have to roll pretty high for this. And we rolled a 4, and a 4 is no result. That is unfortunate. Yeah, too bad. Too bad, so sad. So let's get back to the actual air combat. And again, something just to point out is technically you should do all the air combats before resolving these actual bombing results, but because this one didn't have any other air combat, we just got it out of the way. It didn't make a difference. All right. So we're going to do air-to-air combat, and to take a look at that is we're going to go to 16.3 of the rules, and that's on page 33 of the PDF that I'm looking at, the version 1.1H. That's the latest we have. And so we're just going to do it in order, right? We're gonna do this. I'm going to take it slow, and we can all follow along, right? So we're going to resolve air-to-air combat one at a time. For each combat, divide your aircraft into 2 groups, bombers and fighters. Now would be a good time, if you're playing in person, to use some sort of player aid chart where you can line these things up nicely. I actually created one a while back, and I put it on Board Game Geek. It's really not great formatting, so I'm not even going to link it because I don't want to advertise my bad skills in making that chart. Maybe someday I'll make a better one, but if you really want it, go out to Board Game Geek. There are also probably other better ones out there that other people have made. So for this particular combat here, it would have also been possible that we have other units here, but just for the sake of it, we've got bombers and fighters, right? So here's the German fighter. I'm just going to use the rest of England as our demonstration. So fighter and bomber. Simple enough. And then England got its fighter here. Again, this is all happening in London. Don't have a good way just to show that. So just remember this is the London aircraft battle. So we have things are separated, two groups, fighters, bombers. Arrange each group into a line from front to back. So if we had another bomber here, this bomber might have been like this. So you'd put each one in a line. In this case, we have so few. This is a good example just to start small. We only have the one. The rulebook states usually it is better to place your best air-to-air rated fighter at the front of your fighter group and your best bombers in terms of bomb factors at the back of your bomber line. So if we had, let's see if I've got which one of these is better than a 3. So if we had this one which had 4, the best strategies the rulebook suggests would be to put this unit with a 4 bombing factor for strategic bombardment behind the one with a 3. In this case, it doesn't really matter, but there you go. Okay. The front unit in each group is the only unit that can be adversely affected by combat unless playing with bounce combat, which is an optional rule, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Until it is destroyed, aborted, or cleared through, thus exposing the second unit in the next round. So you can imagine, these things are flying, and it's who makes it through, and then the next one's sort of the next one that could be hit. It's an interesting level of abstraction, and I get what they're doing with it. It makes sense to me. Let me do a quick time check. Okay, we're at 42 minutes. Okay, so let's look at this. You fight each air-to-air combat in a series of rounds. This series continues till every aircraft on one side is either destroyed, aborted, or cleared through. If a side starts a round with no fighters, all opposing bombers are immediately cleared through to the target. That's obvious. After air-to-air combat, if any, is over, all bombers that have been cleared through to the target carry out the bombing mission, whatever it happens to be, in this case, again, being strategic bombardment. Combat values. Your air-to-air value for each round equals your air-to-air strength minus your opponent's air-to-air strength. You calculate your air-to-air strength at the start of each round. It is equal to the air-to-air rating of your front fighter. And air-to-air is the top left number. Calculate your air-to-air strength. Yeah. It is equal to the air-to-air rating of your front fighter plus 1 for each other fighter. You ignore bomber's air-to-air rating. So if we had another fighter here, like this one, our air-to-air rating there would be 6 plus 1 for 7, not 12. So that's sort of why you want your best one first, because you're going to get the most value for being first, since it's the only one that counts the full value of the air-to-air rating. So we've got 6 there. If you have no fighter group, your air-to-air strength equals the air-to-air rating of your front bomber only. If that bomber's air-to-air value is bracketed, that bomber's side does not roll combat dice unless you are playing bounce combat, in which case the roll may only result in a bounce. Okay. So if we look at this, so because we have a fighter, we're not going to use the 4 air-to-air of the Gotha bomber. We're only going to be using this. All modifiers are cumulative, so resolving the combat. So let's see. Consult the air combat table. The air-to-air combat sequence is the inactive side rolls 2 dice and adds them together. So again, your air-to-air value for each round equals your air-to-air strength minus your opponent's air-to-air strength. And this is why when you look at the air combat chart, the combat values actually have negative numbers that run from -9 to +8. In this particular combat, we are comparing the 6 of the German fighter plane versus the 5 of the Commonwealth fighter plane, which leaves the inactive side, which is the Commonwealth in this case, has a -1. They're going to roll on the -1 chart. And when the Germans roll theirs, they're going to be rolling on the +1 chart. So you can imagine, if the difference is much greater, then it's going to have an equally bad effect for the people who are behind, and an equally good effect, or roughly equally good effect, for those who are ahead. Yeah. So the inactive side rolls 2 dice and adds them together. So let's do this. So this is the Commonwealth die roll, 2d10. We rolled a 15. That's pretty strong. That is pretty strong. We cross-index the dice roll with the column containing the inactive side's combat value and implement the result. So -1 of 15 is a DA. A DA. So we're going to implement the result. DA is the same as AA, and I'm reading this on the 16.3.3 and interpreting the combat results. So same as AA, except that the side that didn't roll the dice chooses whether to abort their own front fighter or front bomber. So an AA is the dice roller chooses whether to abort the opposing front bomber or front fighter, then an aborted aircraft, return an aborted face down. Okay. Sorry if sounds like I'm mumbling. I'm reading the results and interpreting it and how to explain this. So had they gotten an AA result, that's good, because it means you get to abort, you, the person who rolled the dice, in this case the Commonwealth, the defender here, gets to choose whether to abort the opposing front bomber or front fighter. And in that case, they would pick the bomber, obviously, right? They want to just abort the bomber. The bomber's not going to get to do any strategic bombardment. But they didn't. They actually got a worse result than AA. They got DA. So it's like AA, except that the side that didn't roll the dice, meaning the attacking Germans, chooses whether to abort their own front fighter or front bomber. Well, they want a bomb, right? So, and this could be a little bit dangerous. It might expose the bomber for doing this, but they're going to have the fighter flip. So they're going to abort their own front fighter. And so we are going to turn it face down. And most player aid charts might show that. So they're aborted. I'm going to sort of slide them over here in the aborted zone for the moment. So the fighter got fended off. Fair enough. We continue on. The active side rolls 2 dice and adds them together. So I believe because we're still at the start of the round, that the value is still the same. So the positive one for the Germans is still here. So we'll roll 2 dice. We also rolled 15 as the Germans. So a 15 on the +1 scale is actually that better result of AA. So AA, again, the dice roller chooses whether to abort the opposing front bomber or front fighter. Well, there's only one choice, so we're going to flip the Commonwealth's front fighter, and they're going to go over here in the aborted zone. Or, depending on how your player aid's set up, maybe it's like over here on the left side. They've been aborted. And so then we have, then we continue on. And then we implemented the result. So then step 5, the active side can voluntarily abort the air-to-air combat. We're good to go. Our bomber's good to go. And then the inactive side can voluntarily abort the air-to-air combat. Well, they have nothing to abort now because their only unit in play was aborted. Losses, in the rulebook notes, losses from the inactive side's roll do not affect the combat value. Let's see. Okay, so now if we were going on to the next round, we would see that if a side starts around with no fighters, all opposing bombers are immediately cleared through the target. So now that the fighter's gone, even if we had to abort our fighter, what we've done is we've cleared the lane for this unit to do the actual bombing. Real quick, before we do that, I want to talk about the bounce combat. So, bounce combat is an optional rule. It makes air combat a little more interesting. Basically, what happens is sometimes you can get a result of DC, which is a fairly unfortunate, like you don't want DC, you want something better. A DC result is the same as AC, except that the side that didn't roll the dice chooses which of their own bombers to clear through. So basically, it's a result where you rolled so poorly that basically the enemy can get one of their own bombers cleared through to the target hex. Right now, that isn't super valuable if you don't actually have any bombers involved. So if I'm, if my opponent rolls a crap roll and gets a DC, and that means I get to pass through bombers, but I don't have any, I just have fighters that were doing combat air patrol, then a DC result is kind of a waste. What bounce combat does is the defender, the person who's getting, who can benefit from the DC result, can either do the DC result if they have any bombers, right? Or they can convert it into a bounce combat. And if they do that, you interrupt the air-to-air combat sequence and you fight a bounce combat. And basically what that means is that they're going to get one of their remaining fighters, and then they take one of their remaining fighters, and then they choose an opposing aircraft, one, they get to pick, a fighter or a bomber that remains in the combat. And then those two aircraft fight one round of air-to-air combat. And it's sort of like a combat within a combat. And so this sort of gives, it expands the different results that could be happening within an air combat to make it a little more interesting. So it's something to look at. I would probably play with it. I think I would. The next time I play a full game, I think it would just be interesting to do bounce combat. But in this example, well, I guess we'll see. Well, if we get this, and we're probably going to have to do this as an additional part because this video is already getting close to an hour. I'll go ahead and include bounce combat so you can see kind of what that is like and get a taste for it, right? So okay, so we've done that, and if we go back to our strategic bombardment rules, so we fought the air-to-air combat. We know the result. The bomber got cleared, and the fighters each aborted themselves. Surviving bombers attack the target hexes. So again, we're going to do the bombing factor die roll. We're on the 2 to 3 column, same as before. And we're going to roll the d10, and we roll the 3. So nothing. Something I'll point out is that if we were successful, the number in the result is going to be the number of production points lost that turn. So there are counters for this. So if I look in here, strat bombing counter. So we would put this here, and it would be the notation that, hey, London was bombed, and we might say 2 production lost. Right? We might do that, and then what that's signifying is that when we calculate production at the end of the turn, the Commonwealth are going to end up with 2 less than they were going to have otherwise, right? And 2 is a fair bit, and it's production points, and I believe that means that is prior to the production multiplier, which gives you the build points. So in reality, this could be knocking off more than just 2 build points. This is 2 production points. So depending on, what their multiplier is, it's going to have that effect based on the proration of the build point. So, unfortunately, we didn't get that, but that's the net effect, right? You're taking away production points that would be and there's also a morale effect potentially for that. So you would end up adding however many production points lost would also be a negative to their morale calculation. So there is a reason to do these strategic bombardments, and early in the game, the Germans do have access to the Zeppelin, and they can, in the early parts of the game, we didn't do it really in my example of play, but they can try to be getting over here to London and doing this bombardment, and before any fighters are in the game, because fighters only come in 1915, you can actually get away with getting some strategic bombardments in without any way to stop it, and getting some morale hits and production hits on the Commonwealth. So anyway, okay, so we gave it a shot. We didn't really manage to bomb anything good. So now we're going to return all remaining aircraft to base and turn them face down. So again, you want to look at their range, right? So we're going to go back 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to instead return on a base back here. You don't have to return to the exact place that you came from. Return to base is just a return to base mission, in which case you just go back to a place that's eligible. So I moved the fighter back here instead, and we'll flip him because he's done, and yeah, he's got 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to send him back here, just for the fun of it, right? And now, this unit's 3, and, well, 1, 2, 3. We'll send it back to Southampton, because that's all we can really, might as well, doesn't really matter. So there you go. So now that we've returned all aircraft to base, we've done all of our strategic bombardment, except for this guy. So we'll 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There you go. Okay. So we've now completed strategic bombardment. That is just one of the phases that involves aircraft, and you can obviously tell next would be ground strikes. So yeah, ordinarily we do most of our ground striking with artillery in this game, but units with tactical bombing ratings, like the Gothas, like this DFWCV plane, they can do ground striking and they can do ground support as part of land combat, and just as if they were an artillery. Now, if you're familiar with World War I, you'll know that tactical bombing really wasn't a thing. They would throw hand grenades from planes, and it really didn't do a whole lot of damage. And that's why these numbers are so low that a lot of the time it may not even be worth trying to do ground striking. But for the sake of the examples, we're going to go ahead and try to do that. But I don't think we're going to do it in this video. This video is running almost an hour long. It'll probably be an hour long by the time I shut up. So we are going to just probably wrap it here in a second. This will be, Advanced Warfare Part 1, unit descriptions, and, air combat example. And we'll continue on from there doing more of these, plus interactions with these ground units. So, ground strikes, it's going to be a very similar process, right? Your opponent, you're going to say, okay, we're going to start ground strike phase. Your opponent is going to do combat air patrol, right? And you might say, I'm not going to do any ground striking, and it's like a fake out, right? They might do that. It could be that, they think you're going to do a bunch of ground strikes for some reason. They might not, but they might. They fly a bunch of combat air patrol, and then you say, you know what, none of this looks good. I'm not going to do any ground strikes. And then those guys, I think, have to go back, return to base, and they're going to flip back upside down. So, that's just one of those funny things. You can deal with. But if we look down here, what's more likely to happen is they're not going to do any combat air patrol. Instead, they're just going to do interceptions, because a lot of these guys are close enough that interception is reasonable, that they're reasonably going to be able to make it if they intercept. So we'll see how that goes next time. Then again, after ground striking, we would be looking at the land combat, and during the land combat phase, There is the possibility for ground support missions where that's the case where you have both sides contributing bombers because the defender is going to send bombers to support their units, and so they're going to have bombers and fighters, and obviously the attackers will have bombers and fighters. Um, and that's really the nuts and bolts of air combat. So we'll probably see in the next video a little more complex air combat involving multiple bombers and multiple fighters, and we'll see how that pans out from there. So yeah, I think this video is long enough. Sorry for a little bit of rambling, but I wanted to make sure that I could introduce these concepts appropriately and show you a little bit of air combat. We'll get into the more extreme examples next time. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit like. If you'd like to see more content like this, hit the subscribe button. We've got more to come, including more, obviously another video or two for this game, and then videos for World in Flames are on the way, and a lot of other games as well. So thank you for watching, and take care. See ya.